Well, Darren, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today at the Imago Day Summit as we kind of take some time to respond to the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors conference that's happening right now in Louisville, Kentucky. And you've had quite the journey of faith, and you're involved in faith communities where you're leading worship and all sorts of amazing things, and had this journey of sexuality that's been interweaved through it all. And so I just want to start off by asking you to take a few moments to just share your journey with us and how you ended up where you're at today.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Brandon. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I always consider it an honor when I have a chance to share. Really, I just see it as what God has done. So many times we have experiences in our lives that we blame God, we blame people. But at the end of the day, I kind of look at it as, wow, in spite of all of these things that I'm still here. And so yeah, I'm Darren Calhoun, and I'm from Chicago. I consider myself to be a community activist and a worship leader. I really do love serving people, in engaging people. Uh, as far as like where I started, I grew up in a small Catholic church on the South Side. That's where I first began to study and figure out what God's purpose was for me. And it was in high school where I got active in leading youth groups and those kind of things. In college was where everything kind of went in several directions. When I was in college, I first really came to terms with my orientation, and I came out at 18, my freshman year of college. And shortly after that, about a year later, I had this born again experience where for a season I did not identify as gay anymore. And during that time, I really invested myself in co-leading a campus ministry, in teaching others about the Word of God. And it wasn't so much you have to change this, you have to change that. I just experienced God changing something in me about who I was. And so all I knew was that I just didn't want to be that gay boy Darren anymore. I just wanted to be Darren, beloved of God. And so for several years, I grew in this calling to ministry, and actually ended up being ordained a year after that. But it was also around that time that my former pastor found out that my testimony was that I used to be gay. And in him finding that out, he told me that I should never ever talk about it again, that I should forget that it ever happened, and that I should be ashamed that that was ever a part of my life. And so now, for the first time, I was introduced to shame. I was introduced to this idea that there was something severely wrong with me. And that led into some really dark times. I spent several years kind of hiding and struggling with with how to understand what God had done. And eventually it led into me pursuing addictive behaviors. In doing that, I felt so isolated. I felt so alone. I was in a church with people who all the leadership never seemed to have any faults, never seemed to do anything wrong. And I felt like, well, here I am. I am 19 years old. I'm a minister. I'm leading a campus ministry. I've got to get it all together on my own. And so I spent years struggling to do that. Eventually, when I came to the end of my ability to struggle on my own, I went back to my pastor and I told him about my struggle. I told him that, I didn't know what else to do and I needed help. And that started a 4-year process of me kind of being cut off from everything. He basically asked me to stay at the church, to live in the church, to stop going to school, to shut down my business, to just kind of pull away from everything else and just stay at the church so that he could, quote unquote, help me. And eventually, about 2 years into that, it was like, well, what's happening? And I'm still having this struggle with my addictive behavior. And so his next step was, well, you need to move away. So he had me move to one of our churches in another state, where at that point I cut off my friends and family. I told everyone to count me as dead. I gave up my car. I gave up my cell phone. I gave up everything, all pursuing what the man of God said this is what I needed to do to be healed. In moving to that other state, one of the things that I realized there was that God's love for me was unshakable. And so I was hearing my church tell me how damned I was. I was hearing my church tell me that the devil wanted me full of AIDS and that I was going to go to heaven with AIDS, which, if you think about it, doesn't even make biblical sense. But this was the kind of culture that I was in, and this was the kind of response that the church had for me as a person who, at the time, I would have said was struggling with same-sex attraction. In that space of a total of 4 years, I literally lost everything, and I was willing to give up everything because the scripture said, you know, if you want Jesus, forsake all you have and come after me. And so I did that. And what I did find is a deep relationship with Jesus. I found a deep, unshakable love from God that in the times where I despaired my life, in the times where I didn't want to live in this pursuit of healing, God would show up for me, and God would remind me that I'm his beloved, and God would remind me that he rejoices over me. And it was contrary to what I was hearing in church. It was contrary to what I was being told. And so eventually I felt like God was calling me to leave that church, that I was to pursue healing. But the healing didn't seem to be what I thought it needed to be. I thought I had to be heterosexual to go to heaven. I thought that I had to somehow change my attractions and change all these things inside of me that I had never chosen. I thought that somehow I had to make those things happen in order to be acceptable to God. But what God was showing to me, and what he used significant people in my life to say, is that I'm acceptable because of Jesus, that I'm acceptable because of what Christ did for me on the cross. And of all the things that God was working on changing my life, he was not still working on changing my orientation. And so eventually I found a church that was a much healthier space for me. And it's the church where I am now. When I first got there, I told them all of my story. I told them all of the things I'd been through. And I was expecting them to tell me to keep on trucking, to keep on fighting for change. And they were the first ones that introduced to me this idea that Jesus saved me, and it's done, that it's assured, that it's certain. And since then, it's been a journey of us figuring out what does faith and sexuality and all that look like. The church that I'm in now, it's a large church, and it is a church with a traditional theology of marriage being between one man and one woman, but they have a deep, tangible commitment to figuring out what does radical inclusion look like in our church. And so for me personally, I've been figuring out what does abstinence look like, what does celibacy look like, what does it look like for me to be in long-term community in churches, because most evangelical churches don't really have a plan for someone to be celibate, a lifelong commitment to that. And so in my church, I've been figuring out not only what does it look like to be a healthy and safe place for people who are, the term that's often used as side B, or who are celibate, but also what does it look like for people who maybe have a different opinion? What does it look like for people who are affirming? What does it look like for people who are partnered to be able to be a part of the body of Christ and a part of our church in active and significant ways? And so it is a ongoing discussion, but it's something that I'm really happy to be a part of.
Wow, I love hearing that journey and seeing that you're standing in this place now, and it's a place where I think you could have very easily become very bitter and reactionary, and instead you found this healing in place of grace where you can stand as your true self, as your full self, and yet be gracious with the people around you who might not understand or agree. I think that's just such a powerful witness to the work of the Spirit in you. So,
Amen.
Thanks for sharing that. I think one thing that I've been asking people, and I think I'd like to hear from you, is being in those environments that really told you needed to change and find transformation and suppress your sexual identity and all of that. What was the effect of that theology on you internally? I mean, you touched on the shame aspect a little bit, but sitting in an environment where you're told that if you want to be acceptable before God, you have to get your this part of you that you can't control or change. You have to figure out a way to change it and get it under control. What was that experience like for you, and for others that you've encountered along your journey?
Yeah. Um, as I said, like in the deepest parts of that, I remember feeling like I could not. Uh, I remember feeling like I could not figure out what to do. I felt helpless. I felt um, hopeless. And like I said, there were points where I literally considered how much better would it be to end my life. I consider myself very fortunate to have had friends and family who refused to leave me when I pushed them away, and they kept reminding me of who I was and that they believed in me. And it felt contrary. It felt like you just cannot do this. Um, so there was that season. But even more recently, that that happened between 8 and 16 years ago. In my more recent experience at my current church, I think about what it means for me, especially to be on stage and to be known. Um, sometimes sometimes when you are gay, people go, well, people knew about you. They just wouldn't be able to respect you as a man of God. They wouldn't be able to hear from you as a church leader. Um, and I think about literally often when I'm on stage at my church or on the platform at church leading worship and thinking that I can look to my left and see people who know me. I can look to my right and see people who are committed to walking through life with me. And I feel a certain sense of freedom. I feel a certain sense of I can bring the hurt and I can bring the hard times that I've come through, and I can really worship God in appreciation and thanksgiving for Him being faithful through all of that. Um, and then when I'm in spaces like the Reformation Project or like the Gay Christian Network Conference, I experience a certain deeper level of presence. There's something special about being in a place where other people have been through the same thing. I used to feel so alone and feel like I was the only one who was wrestling with God on these topics. And then I come to a place where there's others and I meet others and I'm able to fellowship and talk about stories and fun times and horror stories. But when I have that space where I'm around other people who've been through the same thing that I have, there is so much. There's such a deeper place that I go in worship, and I am literally bringing the stories, bringing the experiences I've had, and able to let all of that out and let all of that just come forth. So I can cry really ugly during those times, but it's a place of deep appreciation, and just like in the Bible, they set up a monument and just said, hey, this is where God did something amazing. And I have those moments in my life that if I'm in a church that can't accept me as me, then I can't bring those moments. I can't bring those victories. I can't bring those hard times and lay those down at the feet of Jesus. I have to hold those outside of the church. But when I'm in a church that loves me for me and that is able to see me as who I am in the image and likeness of God, the Imago Dei, then I'm able to bring all of that and to truly enter into what it means to be in a congregation, what it means to be worshiping together. So I don't know. That's something that's just really important to me as I think about how
No,
this affects me.
totally. I love that. That's so beautiful. And as you're talking, it occurs to me that there's probably people watching this video who are in the midst of figuring out their own sexual identity, gender identity, whatever that is, and find themselves very committed to their Christian faith. Um, as a minister, as somebody who's walked through this and is out on the other side and is ministering um, as a whole person in this space, um, what would you, how would you encourage a person who's just trying to figure out, what do I do with this? What words would you have for them?
Yeah. I remember I used to always think that if I just found the right person who had the right message or had the right book or had the right therapy or whatever it was, that I would have all the answers and I'd never have doubts again. But what my experience has been is that there are going to be a billion perspectives out there. There are going to be all kinds of people who insist that they know what's best for your life. But the beautiful thing that we have about faith in Jesus Christ is that he is in a relationship with us, that he's guiding us, that he's given us the Holy Spirit to lead us into all truth. And so what I've experienced is that it's good for me to read. It's good for me to get perspectives from a lot of places. But at the end of the day, I do have to have a confidence from God and in relationship with God to know what God has for me. Because there's always going to be disagreeing opinions. And I spent so many years of my life torn and trying to meet other people's expectations and trying to conform myself to how other people experience God and what was right for other people. But I've met so many Christians who are in so many different places, everything from Christians who are celibate to Christians who are in celibate partnerships to Christians who are gay and in married relationships and raising kids, to people who are in mixed orientation marriages and they're committed to that as their way of honoring God. And what I've realized is that God knows what he's doing way more than I do. And so it's not so much of me figuring out how to get it perfect, but it's more so of me accepting God's grace and walking with him and just following him. I think that God is faithful, that if he would be so clear on so many other things, that he wouldn't leave me alone to figure this out for myself. And so that's the encouragement to trust God, to trust that God will lead you and guide you, that where you start now may not be where you end up. And also to take some risks as far as finding some safe people. There are so many people who have been instrumental in my mental health as well as my spiritual health, that if I had tried to do this on my own or had tried to do it with people that I can be fully honest about with my questions and my doubts, then I would not be here today. But it's people who've been willing, even if they disagree, who've been willing to sustain relationship, commit to relationship, and walk with me. Those are the people who've made all the difference in my journey.
Yeah, that's all so good. I've experienced all of that in my own life, and I think that's such a good word of wisdom. And I think just as we kind of wrap it up, the last group of people I want to have you talk to is just imagine that today at the end of the conference in Kentucky, they gave you 5 minutes to get on the stage and just say something to the pastors and the counselors that are kind of probably in this very conservative space and haven't really experienced the full array of what it looks like to be struggling with your sexuality and faith, and just don't have that ability to empathize. Yes. What would you say to that group of people? What would you want them to know as they go back to their congregations after this conference and begin counseling and ministering to LGBT people that are struggling and looking for answers?
Yeah. First, I'd just like to appreciate any ministry leader who's committing to having these conversations, to finding out about this, because sometimes there can be a stigma about even asking questions or not having all the answers. So going someplace to learn about this topic is really important, and I certainly commend that. What I'd also say, though, is that it's really important that you listen and find voices of people who are in this struggle or in this situation. So often I find that ministry leaders feel like we have to have all the answers, that we have to always know and we have to be able to give a certain answer for everything. And in my own world, that was so damaging. My pastor spent 4 years with me under his 24-hour supervision, literally, only to at the end of that time say, you know what, I really didn't know what I was doing. I just hope that if we did these things, that God would do something. If we had you pray enough and we had you fast enough, that God would do something. And it would have been so much different if he had said something right on and said, I don't know what to do, but let's figure this out together. And so, there's a lot of tension, and I think there's a lot of fear. And if we let the fear go, if we let love cast out all fear, then we can be in relationship and we can tell people we don't have all the answers. And we can hold on to our convictions. You can believe what you believe, but I think it's really important that you make space for some other voices, make space for some other experiences, make space for some other perspectives, and let people come to their decisions. Give people space for that. as a ministry leader, you probably have to create policy, and you have to figure out hard decisions about staffing. And yeah, I get that. I really do understand it. But let's not forget that we are dealing with people who are vulnerable. Right now, churches have the highest rate of suicide for LGBT youth. That shouldn't be the case. But the challenge is that we've made our spaces so unsafe out of our ignorance and out of sometimes our good intentions. And so we have to commit to figuring out what it takes to do better by the LGBT community that are in our pews, that are in our Sunday schools, that are in our small groups. We have to find a better way to engage on this topic. And so I hope that you'll talk to some voices who maybe don't align with everything you already believe, but who definitely have experience with this.
That's perfect. I love that. And Darren, just thank you so much, not only for being with us today, but for being a bold witness about your own story and your journey and the activism work that you're doing and the ministry that you continue to have. It's really inspirational to me, and I really appreciate everything you're doing in the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.